Hello and welcome to week 9 of the MMO development class. So today what we're going to do is finish up the gutter. As we saw last week, we put together, or we've been working on building out the client in a way that would, well, allow us to build out the server without having to worry too much about client code. Or rather build out the integration between the client and server while still being able to test the client code locally without having a server install. Obviously that's very important because otherwise our feedback cycle would be very difficult. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to fire up some code and kind of see if our board still works. That probably should. You know, okay, this is getting ridiculous. I have a thing. Oh no. Uh-oh. There you go. I installed VMware the other day and installed a plugin that always fails to load in Visual Studio, then hangs up the startup process. That's starting to get kind of annoying. I'll have to get that resolved at some point. I wonder if it's even going to load now. Nope, there it is. Of course it loaded in the background because that makes the most sense, I guess. Blah blah blah. So let's jump into our test, give it a board width of 20, board height of 20, come back here. So what we did last week was we got the board scrolling, which is lots of fun. So yeah, basically right now what we're going to be doing this week is giving the gutter the same treatment. The idea is that we should be able to scroll the gutter up and down, and as well as remove individual runes from the gutter to be able to place onto the board. The first thing that I want to do is, at the moment, the way the board is written, so the game board, game object, it's going to start panning regardless of where we press down on the mouse button. And that's going to become a problem because, well, notice how I'm trying to click and scroll this gutter over here, but it's basically clicking through onto the board. I don't want that. I want to make sure that you are not clicking within the gutter when you start clicking and panning the board. So fortunately that's very easy with the coordinate system that I've already put into place here, because we know that each gutter is one grid cell length. The grid cells are what I've been referring to as each one of these units that contains an individual rune. So we can just make sure that when we click, it won't start panning if we are either positive one grid cell or negative one grid cell from the edge. So to do that, I can go ahead and find the code that starts panning, which is right here. So all I have to do is identify where the X and Y position of the mouse is. Now I'm going to think, oh great, yay for me. I know that you can get this with the camera, but I can't remember the exact thing that you need to do the stuff. So what I'm going to do is look up some really quick code here and figure that out. There we go. Yep, it's through the camera. So I just go and say var mouse position equals camera.main camera. And what am I doing? Input position on the... Sorry, it's been a long day. So if, let's go ahead and just extract out the mouse X. So mouse X equals input or mouse position. There, that's going to be the screen space coordinates for our mouse. So then I have to say if mouse X is greater than our game's screen grid cell size X and mouse X is smaller than the game screen resolution X subtracted by our game screen grid cell size X, then set is panning to true. And so that's really all we're going to need in order to make sure that the board doesn't interfere with our gutter. And as you see right here, this works perfectly because of the way I've organized everything as far as their sizings. So yeah, that's all good. Our input is now being ignored for the gutter. So now we have to jump into the gutter and start a similar process. Let's start with panning first, because panning is already something that should be pretty straightforward to implement. It's similar very much to what we already have here in our game board. However, we're only going to be panning on the x-axis. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is jump into our gutter game object and add an update method to him, public void update. And it's going to be very similar to our update over here. So let's go ahead and create an isPanning private variable. So private boolean isPanning. When we start the game, let's just initialize that to false. Now an update, so if I say if we are panning, then pan gutter. Otherwise, if we're not panning, but the input dot, let's take a look at it, input dot get mouse button down, or hold on, I have to, if we're panning and input dot get mouse button up 0 is going to reset our isPanning to false. Otherwise, pan the gutter. Next up, if our get mouse button down 0 is there, then what we're going to want to do is do basically, wow, I am tired today, aren't I? Then what we're going to do is basically the opposite of what we did with this game board. First, we have to make sure that the X position of the mouse is correctly in the gutter. Then we start initializing the isPanning equals true. So I'm going to extract the mouse X. So input.mouse position X. Then I'm going to do a test. Now I'm going to go ahead and just write this into another method. I'm going to say is within gutter X. Mouse X is pan equals true. Let's go ahead and implement this method. And the reason I'm extracting it out is because the code is going to be a little bit, it's going to be a little bit gross. We're going to have to say if our location of our gutter is left, then we need to make sure that the mouse X is smaller than the game, blah blah, rune game screen grid size LX. Now otherwise, we need to make sure that the mouse X is bigger than the rune game screen resolution X subtracted by rune game screen grid cell size X, blah blah blah. Words and stuff, you get what I'm saying. So now that's going to identify if we are in the correct gutter. So now I'm going to go ahead and implement pan gutter. I'm just going to check out what I did over here. I multiplied my mouse X by 15. I'm going to go ahead and repeat that. Maybe I should extract this into a constant, but I'm pretty happy with how the board is moving already. So that means all I got to do now is translate the position of the gutter inner. Now if you recall, we have this gutter game object, but it contains the inner, which contains our runes. Our gutter itself is what has the background. So what we want to translate is the inner of the gutter. So to do that, I can say inner transform local position equals new vector 3 inner transform. Oh, hold on. I wanted the y delta, not the x delta. Sorry about that. Equals inner transform local position dot x inner transform local position dot y plus y delta, and then inner transform local position z. And then what are you complaining about? Stop it. You have nothing to complain about. Stop highlighting. Resharper slurring a fit, whatever. Okay, so at this point now I should be able to pan the board. And I can, but it's super, super sensitive. The reason it's super, super sensitive is probably because I need to modify this calculation by my transform local scale dot y. And I mean, that's not exactly what I was looking for right there. So let's figure this out. Can you lower your y dot delta? I can, but I want it to have the exact same feeling as the board. So I want to figure out how I can do this without changing that modifier, because it should technically work. What am I doing here? Blah blah blah. How do we position the inner again? We position the inner. No, in this case, notice how I'm dividing the calculation of the absolute coordinates by the transform local scale y. Alright, so if anybody gets anything out of these videos, it should be how to debug problems like this. Okay, let's look at our inner and let's watch its position. So it basically just likes to reset itself back to 0 for some reason. Though if I take that calculation off, it doesn't. See, now if I jump into left gutter inner, take a look at that and pan it, now it's just super sensitive. Which is fine because I'm scaling it up in the y-axis quite a bit. Y-axis, whatever. Inner transform position. I'm sure I have just a... No, it's not order of operations that's wrong here. Oh, you know what? I should... Probably this would make more mathematical sense. Transform the... Yeah, do that. Whoops. Do that. I know order of operations is going to be the same regardless of the parentheses, but I like the parentheses because I don't like to think about that sort of stuff. Here we go. Sorry about that, guys. Now we have a properly scrolling gutter. And it has the exact same... the reason I wanted to use that 15 modifier is I wanted to have the exact same feel as much as possible with the board. So by doing that, I can now scroll the gutter up and down. However, it's not constrained to anything. Let me go ahead and go back to this, go back to my code that instantiates the board. I'm going to change the board width to, how about 10 by 10? That should... Okay, that's too many. For testing purposes, I want it to be easy to scroll to the bounds of the gutter. There we go. Okay, so here's my gutter. I can move it up and down. Both of them respond appropriately depending on if I'm clicking on the right-hand side of the screen or the left-hand side of the screen. So that's all good. Next up, let's go ahead and figure out how to constrain the gutter to the minimum y and maximum y. Now that should be pretty straightforward. We just got to go in and let's calculate that and set it into a private variable. So private float min y, private float max y. Now I want to do this calculation not in the game board. I did that calculation and initialize, but that's because the game board knows its width and height. However, the gutter doesn't know how many runes are going to be in it until all the invocations of add rune happen, which means I have to calculate the min x, or the min y and the max y in my start game method. So, one of these is going to be 0, but instead of sitting here and figuring out which one is going to be 0, I'm just going to jump in here and play around with my scene. So when we set the y to 0, what do we get? We we get that. So 0 is going to be the maximum y, always. Now, the minimum y is going to be the size of the gutter subtracted by the resolution divided by the transform local scale y, negated. So it's going to be negated, and then it's going to be the resolution of the screen. So that's going to be rune game screen resolution y subtracted by the height of the gutter, which is the same thing actually. So pretty much is going to be negative screen resolution y, isn't? No. See, I had this figured out 1 second ago, and then I completely lost it again. So the size of the gutter is going to be this, height of inner. So we can reuse that. I can just say height of inner subtracted by the resolution y. Now, the height of inner is always going to be larger than the resolution y, so I'm going to subtract the resolution y by the height of inner, negate that, then divide it by transform local scale y. So I think that's about right, which means I have to jump over here, and on pan gutter, I'm going to extract this into a variable. I'm going to say new y. Then I'm going to say if new y. What are the rules of the game is being made? It's a pattern matching game, multiplayer pattern matching game. So if new y is larger or smaller than the min y, then new y equals min y. And yes, I know I could use a math function to do this, but this is more explicit. New y is greater than max y. New y equals max y. So there we go. That should constrain the gutter. So we can go up to 2. Is that the height of the gutter? I can tell if it's the height of the gutter by jumping over here. It is indeed. So that constraint works. And is that the bottom of the gutter? It is the bottom of the gutter. So the top of the gutter is 2, and the bottom of the gutter is 0, and 0, 2. Top of the gutter of that is 6, which works, and 3 is the bottom of the gutter, and 3 is the bottom of the gutter. Okay, so now we have gutter panning. So that's nice, but now this is where things get complicated. When we were playtesting this game, I spent a lot of... Number 9 is sad that it got left out. Huh? Did I leave number 9 out? Hold on, let me switch over to an orthographic view. Oh yeah, there is no 9, is there? Huh. Yeah, I actually don't think I got the coordinates of my sprites correct. I'm starting to think that I might have messed those up a little bit, but that's not the point of this. I'll fix that when we go in and add the rest of the runes in. I just added one set of runes in, but we have another set too that we can play with. Okay, so the next challenge is going to be pulling a rune out of the gutter. And during playtesting, we tweaked this logic quite a bit, and I believe I pretty much remember how it goes. So if you click down, it records the rune that you clicked on, and then you can pan as much as you want until you leave the bounds of the gutter, at which point it considers that to be you picking up that rune. And at that point it'll stop panning, and then it'll attach the rune to the mouse, and then you'll be able to place the rune onto the board. So the first step is we need to figure out which rune we initially clicked on. And doing that is pretty straightforward, although it's going to require that we add a component to our rune game object in order to do the raycasting. So to do that, I can't remember which component. Mesh collider. It's a mesh collider. That's what it is. So on initialize of rune game, whatever, I'm going to say game object add component mesh collider. And since our mesh is so simple, it doesn't matter. Actually, I could probably just use a box collider. That should work the exact same way. So in our gutter go, if we are within the gutter X, now we need to determine if we hit a rune. So to determine if we've hit a rune, we use Unity's built-in raycasting, which is very easy to do if you remember what the API looks like. But fortunately, I can cheat. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var hits equals physics dot raycast all, and then I'm going to turn. So I'm going to use the camera to translate a screen point into a world point, so or into a ray specifically that's in the world space. So I'm going to do camera dot main dot screen point to ray, and then I'm going to do input dot mouse position, and there. Now I have my hits. Now I need to determine if my hits contain any game object that has a rune in it. So I can say var hit rune equals hits, single or default. H goes into H dot, let's see, what's the best way to do this? I can do collider dot game object dot actually, you know what would be easier? If I just say select many, T goes into collider, game object, get components, mono behavior, of type, rune go, dot single or default. Let's do first or default, just, that should never happen. Now let's do single or default. It should never happen, and it'll throw an error if I do hit multiple runes, which should never ever happen. So it throwing an error would be an indication to me that something is totally wrong. Anyway, so now we have a hit rune that can be null, but if it's not null, it means that we clicked on a rune. So I'm going to need to track that. So I'm going to go up here and say private rune go selected rune, and then I'm going to say selected rune equals hit rune. So now that we know what rune that we clicked on when we initiated the panning, if our if our mouse X ever goes out of the bounds of the gutter, so if this is ever false, then we know we need to start moving. So what I can do is now I can say else if selected rune does not equal null. So if this if branch happens, that means our mouse button is down. We are not within the gutter's X coordinates, or it's within the bounds of the gutter. But we know we're still technically panning, quote unquote, and we know that we clicked on a rune to initiate the panning, which means we now have to pick up that rune and say that it's now being moved by the mouse cursor. So what I'm going to do is I have my is panning up here. I'm going to have another private bool is moving rune. And if this is true, then we are no longer panning, we're technically moving the rune. So at that point, what I can do is I can say if is moving rune, otherwise if we're panning, and then I can set is panning to false and is moving rune to true. Now if we're moving the rune, what we need to do is, well, we need to move the rune. So move rune. How about move selected rune? So now we have our move selected rune and our pan gutter methods that should, according to this method, just be nice little convenient, handy places to place our logic for moving a rune or panning the gutter. So when we move the rune, let's go ahead and get our X delta and our Y delta. So X delta and Y delta, mouse X, mouse Y, and then let's say selected rune, transform. Well, this is where things are going to get a little bit tricky. Let's see what happens if we do I'm going to have to change this code. I already know it. But in order to change code, we have to start from somewhere. So let's start with this. Okay, so this is going to be selected rune transform position x plus x delta, y plus y delta, and then I'm going to copy the z in from what it used to be. So selected rune transform position z, y, then y. And finally, if we are moving the rune, then I need to check to see if mouse is up, then we drop the rune. In this case, all I'm going to say is moving rune is false. And I can nuke those parentheses. Although I might actually have to bring them back in a moment here, because when you drop a rune, it's a little bit more complicated when you stop panning a gutter. But we'll handle that in a moment once we get the rune actually picked up and moving. Whoa. Well, that's kind of what I want, but not really. So I click on this 4, and I'm moving the 1. Okay, that's trippy. Let's restart this and figure out why Rune Game is having a seizure. Okay, so I click on the 7, move out, and nothing happens. Nothing still happens. Okay, so the left gutter doesn't work at all. Oh. What? Okay, that's a bit of a trip. Weird. Alright, let's look over the logic again. Oh yeah, I should initialize is moving a rune to false as well. And then when we drop a rune, I want to say selected rune equals null. I'm going to move this out of its own, into its own method. Drop rune. And to be consistent, I'm going to say drop selected rune. And that's not how you spell rune. There we go. Okay. So let's look over this. If we are moving the rune and our mouse button is up, then drop it. That's good. Otherwise, move the selected rune. Move selected rune just modifies its translation, blah, 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 transform, I mean. So that's good. Otherwise, if we are panning, then do that. Otherwise, pan gutter. That's all good. Now, if mouse button is... Oh, right. I need to move... No, I don't. Yeah, I need to move this code out of this if statement. So what I need to do is say... So that's all good. But now up here, I need to say else if is within gutter x input dot mouse position dot x, then pan the gutter. Otherwise, pick up rune. And what does pick up rune do? Pick up rune says we are no longer panning, and says we are moving. We'll do a few more things later. There we go, that should work. I say that too often, don't I? Awesome. So I'm now able to pick up the rune. I can pan, and then I can pick up the rune if I want to. Now, something that I'm going to have to do, however, is when I translate it, actually what I'm going to want to do is take the, instead of moving the X and Y delta, what I want to do is I want to take the mouse position, convert it into world space coordinates, and set that to the runes thing. So instead of doing this, what I want to do is I want to say Actually, the way I have everything done already, I can just use straight up. That's the nice thing about setting the orthographic size to half the resolution, is what I can do now is I can just say input dot mouse position dot x, input mouse position dot y. And then actually I'm going to do one, dot x, and then I want to subtract that by half of the Rune game screen grid cell size x. And then because I want the, when you pick up a rune, I want it to be centered into the mouse cursor. So now let's see what happens. So I pick up a rune, and hey look, I have now picked up a rune. And I can do this on the other side too, all I want. And there shouldn't ever be any confusion about if you're panning or picking up. So now all of that stuff is good. Okay, the next thing I gotta do is I gotta record the initial position of the selected rune when we pick it up so that we can snap it back to place once we release the mouse cursor. So I can do private vector3 selected rune starting position. Then what I can do is jump down to my pickup selected rune. I can say selected rune starting position equals selected rune dot transform dot position. Oh, by the way, when I say pickup selected rune, I'm assuming that selected rune isn't null, which isn't a very good assumption to make. So I'm going to say else. I'm going to say is within, if selected rune does not equal null and is within gutter X. So that means if selected rune is ever null, it'll always pan, no matter how far away you move the mouse cursor. Okay, so now we're recording the selected rune starting position. So when we drop the selected rune, before we set it to null, what I want to do is say selected rune.transform.position equals selected rune starting position. So now that should snap it into place once we let go of the mouse button. And, hey look, it does. Alright, so how's everyone feeling so far? Oh, I got an exception. Null reference exception, object not set to an instance of an object on move selected rune. Somehow move selected rune is being invoked when selected rune is null. That's not what I want at all. Let me try to reproduce that error. How did I do that? It's kind of hard to miss a rune because it's all filled up. Because it's not bringing the fact that they're transparent into account for the ray casting. Because technically all these runes are just quads. How did I... You manage to click on a rune's position before it has time. No. I'm trying to click as fast as I can, it doesn't... Whoops. That totally messed everything up. Because I have a free aspect ratio. I really need to constrain my aspect ratio because that's one of the assumptions I made about this code base, is that it should have a fixed aspect ratio. Okay, maybe that was just an isolated Unity bug. Probably not, though. I'm sure before we get done today I'll run into it again. But hopefully by then I'll have an easier time. I mean, maybe if I click right on the edge... Nope, still picks it up. Still picks it up. Whatever. Okay, next up, next up, actually, I want to make sure that you, on really small boards, let's go ahead and do that real fast, because I remember this was an edge case with the board itself. Yeah. Whoa, object. Okay, maybe it is. Maybe I did somehow manage to click on a, not click on a rune. That doesn't make any sense. Hold on, let me, is that the first instance of the error? No, the first instance of the error was 101 when we said pick up selected rune. Oh, what a, wow. Am I really that dumb? Else if. There we go. Now, the thing about move selected rune is this should never be invoked if selected rune is not null. Because the only way you can get into that is to have is moving rune just be set to true. And the only time is moving rune is selected to true is if pickup selected rune is invoked. And now, previously I didn't have this check in here, that's what I just added. Selected rune should never be null if you've hit a rune. So I think that one conditional should have fixed it. Yep. Okay. However, it does, I do now have a problem like I had with the board. I'm going to have to disable panning if there's no panning to have to occur. So that's really easy to do. I'm just going to go the easy way out. Private bool can pan. And then can pan is going to be set to if the height of inner is greater than the rune game screen resolution Y. And then to disable panning, now this is going to be kind of tricky. Disabling panning without disabling my ability to pick up runes. I think the easiest way to do that is to jump into the pan gutter method and say if we can't pan, then simply return. So that will leave all the rune picking up logic unchanged. Good, so we can't pan, but we can still pick up runes. And I no longer get that error. Now, because I just made a few changes, let's go ahead and bump this up to 5x5 and make sure that I can still pan. Yep, I can pan just fine. And I can still pick up runes. Okay, the next thing I want to do is, in the original rune game, when you were hovering over a board slot, it would actually kind of highlight the board slot you were about to drop it into. We found that that's just a really nice little UI thing to do that I can implement really quickly. Basically, we have these tile highlights texture, and if I open this up, we just have a sprite map of different tile highlights. So I believe, let's just use the yellow for mouse over. So to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into my rune slot game object. And the rune slot game object has a rune slot symbol and has a tile slot background associated with it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a, what's the best way to do that? Actually, I'm going to go ahead and step outside and figure out how I want to approach that. It's been about an hour, so give me a moment, and when I come back, we will get slot highlighting in place, and the slot highlighting in place will necessitate that we write the code to actually figure out which slot we're hovering over, which will then make it very simple to implement the actual, well, dropping of a rune into a slot. And hopefully by the end of the day, we'll have actually a fully featured game board. So I'm going to go ahead and we're back. While we're on break, I just discovered a bug. It's just a pretty straightforward z-index bug. You'll notice that runes are, the rune that you're currently picking up isn't being placed within the proper z-index because it can appear underneath other runes in the gutter, and obviously that doesn't really make any sense. So to fix that, I'm going to jump back down to my gutter go, and our selected rune starting position includes the Z component, so when we snap back it'll reset the Z component. So that means that all we got to do is set the Z component up here to something that'll make it appear above other runes. And because the camera is placed technically behind the board, I can just toss in a -30. I really need to consolidate all my Z indexes at some point. But anyway, now that's fixed. So that looks good. Okay, so to get highlighting going, let's start off with an enum. I'm going to create a slot highlight type enum. I'm going to have a slot highlight type of none and a slot highlight type of hover. Then I'm going to create a texture map for this. So I'm going to create a new class and say slot highlight texture map, which will have a private read-only, just because of consistency. Yeah, I did that in the thing, didn't I? So private static read-only dictionary of slot highlight type and texture assigner, slot highlight textures, and then I can go ahead and say static slot highlight texture map. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the none from this, and I'm going to have this slot highlight type be represented as nullable. So that way I won't be forced to add in a slot highlight texture for a nullable, or for a none, which wouldn't make any sense. Okay, so now if we look at our thing, let me see, I have these numbers around here somewhere. There we go. So they're 128 by 128, so what I can do is I can say slot highlight type of hover and give this a new sprited texture assigner and initialize that to tile highlights. I should really rename that texture file, but unfortunately I've already distributed these texture files, so I don't want to confuse people. Anyway, the sprite X for an overslot highlight is 1, sprite Y of 0, sprite width of 1 to 8, and 1 to 8. And then now as we add more slot highlight types, we can change what, yeah, we can just add more to these, to this dictionary. And then finally I need a way to access it. So I'll say public static texture assigner get highlight texture assigner slot highlight type return slot highlight textures type, and I'll let that throw an exception in case it's not found, which should never happen. So that's why I want to throw an exception there on purpose, because exceptions are for things that should never happen. Okay, next up I'm going to go into my rune slot, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another game object underneath it. So I'm going to say private game object highlight game object. The highlight game object is going to be simply a new game object with symbol blah highlight of the name, slot.id. I'm going to basically say transform parent equals transform local position equals 0, 0, and I want this to appear above everything, so I'll give it a -2 in the Z. And then I'll do highlight go transform dot local scale equals new vector 3111. And then, now the highlight game object, I'll go ahead and what I'm going to do is my game object helpers, I have this create sprite method that creates my vertices. I'm going to break this out into two methods. I'm going to create my my vertices and my mesh and my material in a different method. So now I'm going to say create sprite mesh. And for some reason I have an out renderer and I don't want that to be an out parameter. So what I'm going to do instead is do that, and then I'm going to take that off, and then filter, take that off, and then void, and then game object dot get component mesh render game object get component mesh filter, and then what are you complaining about? Blah 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 blah. Don't want you. Is never used because it's overwritten. Oh well, yeah. Don't take it as a parameter, you idiot. There we go. So now I have a create sprite mesh, which I can use to create a mesh without assigning a material yet, or assigning a texture yet, because I'm going to be assigning different textures to my highlight game object depending on what state the highlight is in. So then I'll use my game object helpers to create a sprite. Wait, what? Oh, I made it private, didn't I? Create sprite mesh, pass in my highlight game object, and then set my highlight game object's active, which I can't set. I'll set active to false. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a public void set highlight method on my rune slot to rune slot highlight or slot highlight type, which will be nullable. And then I'll say if the type is null, then highlight go set active to false. Otherwise, highlight go set active to true, and then get my highlight texture map dot get highlight texture assigner of type dot assign to my highlight game object get component render mesh render highlight get component mesh filter, which what I can actually do instead of that is do game object helpers dot no, I can't do that, can I? Let's just do it this way. So there we go. And I can't do that because I have to do dot value. Okay, so then now I can set a highlight on my rune slots, which is nice. So now on my gutter game object, as I move my rune around, so every time my rune is moved, what I'm going to have to do is do another raycast and see if I hit a rune slot game object, which pretty much I can just, I mean, I could move that out into an extension method, could I? Whatever, it doesn't matter. So I can go ahead and say hit slot. Raycasts, they can be, but not, they're not going to be, it's basically going to be as bad as collision. Because the raycast is only one ray that's going through the game world, it's basically the same calculation as doing a single collision. It's not like I'm shooting out all rays from a light source to render a scene. So hit slot, mono behavior, rune slot, and then I can say if hit slot okay, so I'm going to have to set the highlight if I hit the slot, but then I'm also going to have to unhighlight whatever I previously hit. So what I can do is just use another private rune slot go hovered slot. I'll reset hovered slot to 0 or to null when we drop a rune. We'll do some more fun stuff with that later. But for now, what I'm going to do is if hit slot does not equal hovered slot, which why are you value objects? it's not a rune slot, it's a rune slot go. So if hit slot does not equal hover slot and hovered slot does not equal null, then we need to reset the hovered slot to, so set highlight null. Then we gotta say, actually what I can do here is I can just say hit slot does not equal hovered slot. If hovered slot does not equal null, then do that. Then if hit slot does not equal null, then set hovered slot to hit slot, and then set hovered slot set highlight to slot highlight type dot hover. And then I can go ahead and inverse this if statement to get rid of some nesting. Okay, so it's not quite working the way I'd expected it to. So what I'm going to go ahead and do to make this debugging a little bit easier, I'm going to jump into my game test manager. I'm going to create a board width and a board height of 2. And then I'm going to see if my highlights ever become active. And they don't. And they probably don't become active because I never set them to be active. How did nobody... Or no, I do set them to be active. So then what is wrong with this? Okay, let's jump back into my gutter go. If hit slot equals hovered slot, then no, that's fine. Raycast, screen point, want behavior of type rune slot go. Let's debug.log out hit slot. And then let's say collapse, and it's never not null. Do you know why I'm doing that? Or why it's not working? It's not working because I never set a box collider on my rune slot. Let's go ahead and do that. Game object dot add component box collider. Okay, it worked for a second. But then it immediately stops working once it does not equal the other ones. Let's figure out why that is. If hit slot equals hovered slot, then return, that's fine. If hovered slot does not equal null... Oh, I shouldn't have had an else if there. Okay, we got an invalid operation exception. How many of them? Got quite a few. Because singular default... Oh, because this is returning more than one? That's not possible. They should never return more than one. Okay, how is that happening? I go up. Now, does it have to do with how quickly I'm moving my mouse, or does it have to do with the order of things that I'm selecting? Seems to be how quickly I'm moving my mouse. Oops, did that never... Okay, when I drop a rune, it no longer gets, it doesn't get unhighlighted. So let's fix that first. If I jump into my drop selected rune, if hovered slot does not equal null, then hovered slot dot set highlight to null. Okay, so that should work for that. Yep, so now they bounce back and they unhighlight, which is good. I'm still getting that weird intermittent error suggesting that the raycast is returning multiple Yeah, that's weird. Let's go ahead and change this from a singular default to a first or default. That should fix that problem. Okay, so now I have highlights going on. Alright, so one of the last things I need to go ahead and do is to implement the logic of when I drop a rune down, I need to basically make an asynchronous call to the server to say that I've dropped a rune, and then the server may either respond by sending an event that the rune was placed or the rune was not placed. Now, during that transition period, or during that asynchronous call, the rune that you are currently selecting should disappear, but it shouldn't go back to the gutter yet. It should only go back to the gutter if the server responds saying that the placement was rejected. So to do that, what we need to do is we need to have the gutter game object pass back or somehow tell the server that we want to place a rune. And so what we can do is this code right here. If the hit slot does not, or not this code, this code. If the hovered slot does not equal null when we drop the rune, that means we're hovering over a rune, or hovering over a slot. So basically we want some different logic here instead of what was previously there. I want to now say something like rune game dot, let's see here. Now what I'm going to do is, I do remember I implemented that interface called iGameView. I'm going to change this to iGameCommands. And then game commands, instead of, I'm no longer going to have a can place rune, I'm going to have a void place rune. And then in my game test manager, I'm going to have a place rune. Now, the mock game commands is going to take in a reference to my rune game go. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if rune.type equals slot.type and rune.runeTypeIndex equals slot.runeTypeIndex, then game dot place rune. And we need to pass in rune.id and slot.id. Then, otherwise, we need to reject the placement. So game.placement rejected, and then we can pass in the rune ID and the slot ID as a reference, although we'll probably be pretty much ignoring those two things. So in this case, it's going to be synchronous because obviously we're not doing anything asynchronous, but I could do something, I could simulate the network, which I'll do in a moment, and have this actually happen a couple frames after the placement has been added. So then at that point, I need to pass my game commands into my gutter. Both my gutters are going to need to have a reference to the game commands in order to send the placement command when it happens. So I'm going to add the game commands argument to both these invocations, and then I'm going to use resharper to generate or to add that parameter. So now if we jump back up to gutter go, we now have an additional parameter to our initialize method called game commands, which I'm simply going to assign to a field. So now what I can do is when we drop a rune, I'll set the highlight to null, then I'll say game commands dot place rune, passing in the rune ID, which is going to be selected rune dot rune dot ID. I don't have the rune property in yet, but I'll have that in a moment. And then I need the rune slot, and the slot is going to be hovered slot rune.slot.id. And then I'm going to, I'll figure out what to do there in a moment. So now we need our rune game object and our slot game object to expose the underlying model that they represent. So to do that, I'm going to jump over into my rune go. I'm going to turn my rune into an automatic property. And then I'm going to go into my rune slot go, and I'm going to turn my slot into an automatic property. And now that should result in this code compiling. Kind of. Maybe. Not really. Oh, it wants an actual rune. There we go. So now I have that done. However, if you recall, what this will do is it'll immediately invoke the place rune or the placement rejected, which I don't like how both of those terms conflict in tense. So I'm going to say rune placed versus placement rejected. That's more consistent. So now if I go in my rune game go, what happens when a rune is placed? Well, if a rune's placed, it's removed from the gutter and placed on top of the slot. If a placement is rejected, then the gutter resets its movement. So I'm just going to say debug log placed for now. And then if placement is rejected, then what am I going to do? Well, let's just say for each var gutter in gutters gutter value dot drop rune, or sorry, reset selected rune. Now reset selected rune is going to contain reset selected rune, let's just say hovered slot equals null drop selected rune, so we can reuse that method, and then on drop selected rune will simply return. Okay, we have a couple errors. Oh yeah, we have to actually pass the game into our mock game commands. And we're good. So if I place 1 on 0, we get an exception, but it at least behaves the way that we want it to. Selected rune is somehow set to null at some point. I know that doesn't make any sense. Oh, right, because we're invoking the drop selected rune on both the gutters. So what I need to do is say, if we're not is moving rune, then return. Good. But if we place it into 1, then we placed it. However, we don't have any logic yet for placing it. So these properly work now. It gets reset if the rune placement gets denied. But if we do place it, then we see the debug log, and now we can go ahead and implement the logic for actually getting the rune out of the gutter and into the thing. Actually, I think, because we do have rune numbers dropped, displacing for right work. Yeah, placing for right works. So we do have these guys. So actually what I want to do is, in the case of dropping a rune, what needs to happen is the symbol inside of the slot needs to turn into one of these. So that means we need another texture map. Rune texture map. So now I have numeric slot sprites, numeric rune sprites, and I need numeric dropped sprites, which will be the texture map. The sprite map that I'm going to be looking at is rune numbers dropped. And then I need another dictionary for rune symbol, or drop symbol texture map. And drop symbol texture map is actually basically going to be the copy and paste of this. So I can copy and paste that, set this to that, and then instead of doing numeric rune sprites, I just do numeric dropped sprites. So those are our drop symbol texture maps. Obviously, like I said before, we still have another set of sprite sheets we can use for other runes, but I'm just using numbers right now because they're simpler to test. So now what we need to do is if we drop a rune, so if a rune is dropped, so the game, Rune Game Go, gets a rune placed event fired into it. What we need to do is we need to get the Rune Game object. Actually, what we can do is we can just destroy the Rune Game object and then tell the slot game object to set its texture as something different. So that's actually pretty straightforward. So what I'm going to do is, what do I have here? So the game board owns the slots, the gutters own the runes. This is going to be slightly frustrating because I don't have a map between rune IDs and rune game objects because those are contained by the gutter. So let's do the slot first and then worry about the rune in a moment. So the slots are all owned by the game board. So what I can do is I can say game board place rune slot ID. So that'll tell the game board it needs to tell its slot ID to be placed. And I do believe I have a dictionary of... No, I have a list of rune slot goes. Why did I make a list of that? I'm going to turn this into a dictionary of uint and rune slot goes. And then that just means down here when I add it, I need to do runeslot.id runeslotgo. Okay, so now I have a dictionary between runeslot IDs and runeslot game objects. So what I can do on place rune is I can say runeslots at slot ID dot place. And all place is going to do is it's going to say rune texture map dot I need one more public method. I need a get dropped assigner. So get dropped assigner for a given rune type and a rune type index, which I can get from my slot, which I never... Oh, I set to a property, derp. Slot dot type slot dot index, and then I can say assign, and then I pass in get component mesh renderer and get component mesh filter. So that'll basically change my actually, I need to do that to my symbol game object. So I need to do symbol dot get renderer and symbol dot get filter. Okay, so now what I can do is I can go 3 and hey look, it's placed. And 2 is placed. And 0 is placed. And now 1 is placed. So that's pretty nice, I guess. I do have some problems though. First of all, our rune doesn't get destroyed yet, unfortunately. And second of all, I can still hover over slots that are already placed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a public boolean to my rune slot go called public bool is placed, get private set. Is placed will default to false, which is the default for booleans anyway. And if we place it, then we say is placed equals true. Then on my gutter go, what I'm going to do on my raycasting for my hovered rune, I'm going to say hit slot equals select menu of type rune slot go where r not r dot is placed. And I can move that into the first or default. So now I will never hover over a place slot. So if I place 1, now I cannot hover over 1, and it'll never place it again. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is actually destroy the rune from the gutter and from being dragged by the mouse whenever we have a placement. So basically the same thing that happens when we have a placement rejected, except for now we're dealing with the gutters. And unfortunately, the way that I wrote that code isn't going to make that particular thing easy, just because we don't know which gutter a particular rune is in, although we do need to inform that particular gutter that it needs to be placed. So the easiest way to do that is to, hold on, rune game go. We have game board place rune slot ID, so that works fine. However, now we need to get the actual rune game object out of the scene. Alright, what I could do is I could have the add rune method return a rune go, as well as initialize the rune game object. Easiest just to move the rune behind the camera. Well, yeah, I could. The problem is I need a reference to the rune game object from just a rune ID, because the server is just going to be passing a rune ID back to the client when a rune's been placed, which means I need to locate that rune game object, but I can't do that because it could be in either one of the gutters, because the runes are owned by the gutters. So what I'm going to do now is the add rune method to the gutter is I'm going to have that return a rune game object, and then have the rune game go contain a dictionary of runes, or rune game objects, based off their ID. Now this class hierarchy is getting, I mean, the code's still pretty straightforward, but I'm not all that happy with the class hierarchy. Okay, so when we add a rune, I'm just going to say var rune go equals that. Rune game objects add rune go.rune.id rune go. And that means that when we place a rune, I can say rune game objects at rune id.place. So now this place method is, well, first of all, it's pretty much just going to destroy itself. And then we can toss in some like explosion effect or something like that at some point. But what I want to do is I also need, when a rune is destroyed, it needs to inform its parent gutter that the gutter needs to remove it from itself, remove it from its list, recalculate its maximum and minimum Y values for scrolling, and reset the position of all the current runes. So what I can do is on the runego.initialize method, I can pass in the gutter that the rune is attached to, so that the rune can then communicate back into the gutter when it's placed. So I can say gutter, place this, and destroy this. So when we place, it's going to be very similar to be reset selected rune. We're going to say hover slot equals null. We're going to say is moving rune equals false. Selected rune, we don't want to set that to null quite yet. Oh, we can actually, because we have another reference to it as a parameter. And then we can say, then we want to destroy, I'm going to move responsibility of destroying it up to the gutter itself. So I'm going to say destroy rune go. Then after that, I'm going to have to remove rune go from our runes list. then I'm going to have to recalculate that the transform of that particular rune, of all the runes, are going to have to be retranslated to fill the gap. But I'll deal with that in a moment. Let's just see if this code worked. So if I place one, one does not disappear for some reason. Yeah, one is still there. Why are you still there? I destroyed you. For some reason, it's still... Wow. I can't tell you how many times this has wasted so much of my time. Notice what I'm doing? I'm saying destroying RuneGo. Well, RuneGo isn't actually the game object. RuneGo is a mono behavior on the game object. So I have to say destroy RuneGo.gameObject. That highlight on the last one? I think I'm having some difficulties with the highlighting. Yeah, I am. It seems like the last rune doesn't want to be highlighted. So that highlights just fine, but when it's the last rune and I hover over one of these, it doesn't want to re-highlight it for some reason. And I'm sure it has to do with this code right here, because that's all that I added in. So let's review this logic real fast. That's the slot that we're hovering over. If it equals the slot that we have recorded as being previously hovered over, then we return because nothing has changed. If the hovered slot is not equal to null, then we set its highlight to null. That should never happen on a placed rune. If the hit slot does not equal null, then set its highlight to hover. Okay, so it seems that if I enter a slot through a placed slot, then it doesn't want to Oh, you know what? I never set the hovered slot to null. If we drop selected rune... No, I do set hovered slot equals null. We get null from a hit slot. Hovered slot should be null. If I place it, I set hovered slot to null. If I drop... I'll figure it out later. It's not important. Be something easier to do when I'm not on camera. But for now, let's go ahead and fix up the one last bit of this gutter. One last problem we have with this gutter. So if I jump into my test, I'm going to give a board width of 5 and a board height of 5. Jump back into Unity, hit run. Now if I place 7, notice how the gutter doesn't reposition all of its runes. What I want to happen is I want the position of each one of the runes to be recalculated every time there's a placement. Then I need to detect if... Actually, I can work on that calculation in a moment. The main thing I want to do is I need to recalculate the position of every single one of these runes, at least as far as every single rune before the one that I've just placed. No, every single rune after the one I've just placed needs to be translated up by one grid size or one grid cell. So what I can do in my gutter go on my place is that once I remove it, let's get the index of it first. So let's say index of rune equals runes index of rune go. Then what I can do is say for var I equals index of rune I smaller than runes dot count I plus plus var rune equals runes at I, and then I simply need to readjust its position based off its new index, which I already have that calculation up here, so I can move that into a method easily enough. So when I create a rune, I set its local position to, it says local position, but then I turn right around and set its absolute position. Why do I do that? Does anybody remember why I do that? That should still work, right? Yeah, looks fine. Oh, and of course now the z-indexes are all messed up. Because I set that to negative 25. Let's set that to negative 2. Yeah, works fine. Okay, so then let's take this and turn this into a method that takes in a index. So I can say private vector3 get rune position by index I'll just do an int index, and then I'll just return new vector3, and then instead of doing runes.count multiplied by, I'll do index multiplied by, and then I'll get local position equals get rune position by index, which will be runes.count. And because this is kind of just like a helper method that I'll use every now and then, I'll just dump this all the way down to the bottom. And then when I place a rune, I'll just say rune.local or transform local position equals get rune position by index I. So that should move all the runes up every time I place one. So if I move one into this, actually that seems to have the opposite effect of what I was looking for. I still need to recalculate the bounds though, of course, but I'll deal with that in a moment. So if I move one over here, this 2 jumps down. If I move 0, 2 jumps down, and it keeps on jumping down. Okay, well that's fine. The most important thing though is I got to recalculate the bounds and then identify if the game or the enter is out of bounds, and then jump it into the bounds that it needs to be under. So if I go into start game, let's see, max X will always be 0, min Y and can pan. Actually, let's do this. Min Y and can pan are going to be recalculated every time. Why do I use the word scrolling? I've been using the word panning everywhere else. So just be consistent, I'll say recalculate panning bounds, and I'll do that every time I modify the size of, or however many things I have, which means I also actually need to recalculate height of inner. Which I guess I can just turn height of inner into a property. Yeah, hold on. So I still need height of inner. And to get height of inner, I need to change this every single time the runes collection is changed. So I need to recalculate that as well. Well, what I could do instead is take that off, take height of inner, turn it into a field. And then, of course, I told it to turn it into a field and it didn't do anything. So let's just do that. Create a field, height of inner. Move this calculation into recalculate panning boards, or panning bounds, and then perform the recalculate panning before that and use that and stuff and things. Wait a sec, did I invoke this twice? Yeah, I invoked this twice. Okay, so then when I place a rune, I need to recalculate the panning bounds every time that happens. And then I'll also, inside of the recalculate panning bounds itself, I'm going to say if can pan, then I'm going to say if inner transform local position dot y is greater than max x, or is greater than max y, then local position equals new vector 3 local position x or max y local position z. Else, if it's smaller than min y, then set it to min y. And then invert that, clean up the code a little bit, jump back to Unity and see if my code actually works. If it's equal, it shouldn't do anything really. So now if I hit 2, yep, everything jumps up, which is what I wanted. But if I do 4 in the middle, it jumps down, that's fine, I don't really care. And then if I do 3 here, see at this point I can no longer pan, which means actually what I should be doing is I should be centering the inner. If I can't pan, then I want to center the inner. Which means I'm going to take out, I have code that centers it already. I'm going to extract this into another method and do private void center inner. And then center inner will be invoked when we start the game, but it'll also be invoked if we can no longer pan. Because if we can't pan, then we want it to be centered. And it indeed centers. There we go. 7 and then 6 and 5, 4, 8, 1, 3, and 3. Alright, so then just to test something, let me set the board width to 4 and the board height to 10. So now the board should be panning, so the board does pan. And now I'm able to do 1 and then 0, pan the board up a little bit, put in a 5, and then a 1 down here. And it seems that everything is working out pretty well. I mean, it looks like the gutter never goes out of bounds, which is good. And then when we get the gutter to the point where where it can't pan because there's nothing to pan to, it starts centering. And then finally, it's empty. So there we go. We can pan the gutter, we can pan the board, we can place runes, we can reject rune placements or accept them, which again will be the server's responsibility. Although the code that does actually handle the rejection and the acceptance is going to have to be switched up just a little bit because I think it looks really ugly. Let me run through the code real fast. Because I know the gutter started to get a little gnarly with the last bits of code I added as far as the recalculate panning bounds. And I guess that's fine. You can't really make code like this look pretty. So the best you can do is stuff them away into methods that have nice names. That's spelled wrong. How did nobody catch this? Is within X bounds. So then we have pan gutter, which is straightforward enough. The biggest concern that I have is reset selected rune and we have reset selected rune in place. Now I think place is fine, and I guess reset selected rune is fine, but we are going to have to start thinking about, and again, I'm just thinking out loud right now, trying to go through anything that I could be doing that would make it harder to implement the server in later. But we're going to have to worry about what if you are holding a rune and somebody else places it. What's that going to do? If I think about it, that should be actually fine because it'll reset the drop state, it'll destroy it, and then yeah. So this place method should work regardless if it's you that's placing the rune or if it's the opponent that's placing the rune. Both cases should work fine. And then the reset selected rune just says hover slot equals null and drop selected rune. That's fine. However, we do have to think about one more thing we have to think about as far as letting the gutter be a part of the server or part of the network client, is that there's a period between when you pick up a rune and you're moving a rune and you drop it, and then there's a period that you have to wait before sending that command in, which happens right here, and having the reset selected rune or the place method invoked. So let me see. I mean, there's really not much you can do here. We could play a little animation or something, but I kind of like the idea of the rune just kind of sitting there. But if you were to pick up another rune, see that now, well, you shouldn't be able to, because if there was that much lag in the game, it would be problematic in the first place. Okay, so it is something that I have to think about, though. So I'm going to, over the next week, I'm going to figure out how we can actually get this working a little bit nicer, where you'll be able to place multiple runes as the server is waiting to accept or reject your placement. So I'm thinking that should be pretty straightforward. If we look at our rune game Go, I mean, everything is pretty coupled at this point. I like the way the gutters were fairly decoupled up until I started to have to yank out the rune game object they instantiate. But I'm still thinking that's fine because technically you're only doing that to be able to know which gutter a rune is in, and that should be okay from a design standpoint, I think. Alright, is there anything else that I could do today? I guess I can go ahead and in the next few minutes take a look at that bug that's causing highlights not to work when you move over a placed slot. So to do that, I'm going to jump into here, and I'm going to give us a board width of 4 and a board width and board height of 2. And then, okay. So unless there's anything else that people want me to talk about today, specifically, I'm going to see if I can knock this bug out real fast. First thing I need to do is figure out how to reproduce it consistently, because it seems kind of random. But it has something to do with moving over oh, you know what it has to do with? That's actually, no, why do you... You know, the hovered slot might not be set to null in the case... Let me look at that real fast. That's under Gutter Go. Drop place, move selected rune. That's the bug right there. I only set the hovered slot to the hit slot if the hit slot is not null. But regardless if the hit slot is null, I still want to reset the hovered slot to null. So that should fix the problem. So now, let me, it was the easiest to reproduce that bug when I had everything placed but one thing. And now it seems to be working just fine. Let me refresh BuzzNet just in case it failed on me again. Alright, looks like we got that bug figured out. So runes get placed. I'm not going to work on things like the original version of the game. I had sound effects and explosion particles and stuff like that that I was pulled in from some sort of open source library. I'm not going to worry about this for this game. This is just about where I want it to be for our purposes. I kind of wanted to spend a couple weeks getting the client put together so I can kind of get back into Unity myself. But now that we have this implemented in a fairly object-oriented fashion, where we can, didn't you have highlighting to originally set up to only highlight a legal drop? Did I? I can't remember if I did. Well, I have the old code up right here. Let me, God, I did it in such a different way. It's going to be kind of hard to, so panning the board, who owns the, so over highlight, it looks like, no. If the rune is over, who's that invoked by? You are invoked by drag rune. No, it looks like, well, that would make the, yeah, I don't think I did. According to the old code, that particular highlight is applied anytime the rune is over, or the rune is over any slot, not just the slot that would be valid. Because I want to keep this as much of determining if the slot is valid to the server as possible. And then basically have the client, like for example, let's say that we have a special rune that if you place it, it automatically places 4 slots, around that rune that you placed. I want that to be handled kind of by the server. And it also makes the game a little bit more difficult because it's no longer a matter of just, kind of dragging a rune over the board and seeing where it highlights green. So I don't believe that's how it worked before, but if it is, I don't want it to work that way for technical reasons as well as gameplay. All right, so yeah, like I was saying, this is pretty much where I wanted the game to be in order to start playing around with connecting it to the server. I mean, it's really simple. The code could be a little bit cleaner, but it's so little. Okay, you have a slight bug with forms. Oh no. All right. Well, yeah, I am about wrapping things up. Like I said, the code's straightforward enough. It's not overbearingly difficult to understand. Everything's in their own place as much as they should be. But the Gutter Go probably has a little bit too much responsibility than I'm comfortable with. So that might be something I'll take a look at. Might be something I'll be taking a look at refactoring is the Gutter Go, so that it's less responsible for the amount of things that it is. The game board, I'm pretty happy with how the game board turned out. I can't really think of many other ways to change this. I mean, it's only 119 lines long. Its single responsibility is to manage the panning of the game board, which it does with fairly straightforward code, so I'm not too worried about that one. Yeah, it's really just the gutter that I kind of wanted to fix up, but that's not the biggest concern. Alrighty, so unless anybody has any questions. Hello? Well, I don't see anything. So I guess I'm going to be heading off. So I guess goodbye to all you future people.